Another diagram. So this one looks, I mean, when I look at this one, Dave, I'm not sure what you want to call out, but I see, we have three columns rather than the two columns from, or sorry, three columns rather than the four columns from the previous diagram. So it looks a little simpler this way. Anything else you wanted to call out in this one?
So in the last diagram, the partnership between the OIDC provider and the OAuth client was between the client application and the OIDC provider. So it was the native app or the mobile app or the web page that was configured that had to configure a partnership with the OIDC provider. It had a client ID and a client secret. In this pattern, that partnership is between the provider and Domino. So Domino is technically acting as an OAuth client in this scenario. So you configure the client ID, in Domino. You configure the client secret in Domino, and the that callback URL, the redirect URL that we saw used to hand control back to the application in the last diagram is handing control back to Domino.
So Domino is
Um,
much more involved in this interaction than in the previous one, the HTTP bearer auth.
yes. We thought we were going to get away in 1202 with just building that much simpler flow. All we had to do was acquire some metadata from the OIDC provider and use that to validate a JWT bearer token, and we were done. Congratulations, feature complete. No, we have end users and partners and customers and people actually, downloaded our early access and they said, hey, this bearer authentication stuff is great, but what I really want is this other flow, please. So there was a great deal of work in the uh, back end of the 1202 development cycle. Um, First, proving that we could build these flows in Domino, that we could support this pattern, and then shaking it out and getting it running completely.
But it
Um,
sounds like, props to HCL for listening to the, client community on that one.
yeah, we love feedback. We try to solicit feedback everywhere that we can. Um, but yeah, thank you for telling us that we were barking up the wrong tree and adding bearer authentication. Although I'm in conversations with a number of partners now who want, more enhancements for bearer authentication, but we can talk about that in a future video.
But if we step back for a second, what we just said in the previous video was that the developer is making the admin's life easier, and yet this diagram illustrates to me that there's more going on. What you're really saying is that the functionality that's built into Domino to handle OIDC does all of these steps, and it's not that either the admin or the developer needs to worry about it, right? There's an entry point and an exit point, but everything else is handled internally by Domino.
Yeah, exactly. Once you've configured OIDC login on your Domino server, and it's actually enabled through Note-Cinis because, as I mentioned, we added this in response to requests on the early access forums, which was after template freeze. So we weren't able to make any template changes in the UI to configure these flows. So there are a whole pile of INIs that are pointed out in the documentation to do the configuration. But just like in SAML, if you configure a Domino server for SAML, the user tries to access a resource, they're not authenticated yet, they're redirected to SAML for authentication. In this scenario, the same thing happens. The user makes an unauthenticated request to a Domino resource, but instead of sending them directly to the OIDC provider, due to the way the protocol works, we need to send them to another internal endpoint first, which in 1202 is, names.nsf question mark OIDC login. We preserve their original URL and the target link URI parameter. And then, that command handler will build the 302 redirect that the OIDC client did in the previous diagram. And then, these next arrows here with the web browser are the same thing that we saw before with the user agent talking to the OIDC provider. but that final redirect there that comes back to the redirect URI, that comes back to your Domino server. That comes back to our command handler in Domino. And then we parse out the code and the state, validate the information to make sure that this information we got aligns with what we sent. So no one's trying to pull a fast one on us. We have, a couple of encrypted cookies and some other fun things to prevent someone from faking out that flow. And then, Domino does the work of exchanging all of that information for a ID token, which we then cryptographically verify in much the same way that we did the bearer token in the last flow. Except here, the user isn't going to be sending that ID token on each flow. The web browser never sees the ID token. So instead, if you're configuring OIDC login, just like with SAML, you need to configure session-based authentication. So that way the server would send back an LTPA cookie or a DOM sesh ID cookie to maintain the user state. And one of the nice things about this pattern versus the other one from my perspective, from the perspective of a developer, is that because this is you can think of it as the primary use case of OpenID Connect 1.0. It was intended, in large part as an evolution of the OpenID. I don't know if you remember OpenID, but it was an earlier attempt to allow people commenting on blogs and other low security applications to be able to have their identity registered in one place and to not have to build separate accounts on all the different blogs they were commenting on. But it was hideously insecure. It offered no actual security. And it didn't work well with anything else. And so OpenID Connect is actually a combination of people from the OAuth community and people from the OpenID community and people from the IETF security working group working together to provide the functionality that the OpenID folks wanted to build in the first place and to build the authentication capabilities that OAuth so desperately needed, but to do it in a manner worthy of the IETF. And so that brought us OpenID Connect 1.0. So like this ID token is new with OIDC. So pretty much anyone who says they support OIDC and publishes all the right endpoints and provides an ID token will do so using the standardized claims. So we're going to have much broader support in OIDC. So much like with, the SAML 2.0 functionality that was added in Domino 10, we've only tested against 4 OIDC providers in the 1202 timeframe. But if you find a well-behaved OIDC provider, Domino should work with it as long as it is compliant to the OIDC standards.
Cool.
Yeah, thanks for that. You don't often get a history lesson with a network flow diagram.
My apologies.
No, that was great. That was great information.